It's connecting, and we are now streaming on Facebook, and we've got the webinar live. It's all happening. If you can hear my voice and you can see my video and my screen, please type your name and your country into the chat box so we know that the tech is working, or not, which it hopefully is. Colleen is here as well, and I'm just going to allow Colleen to show a lovely video. You are going to be co-host in a moment. Cool. We've got we've got Pete from Kingston. We've got Tony from Oz. Dawn from Dawn. Just Dawn. Where are you from, Dawn? Also, I've just noticed that Zoom has decided to make everyone, well, almost everyone, just all panelists in the chat box. So just change it to all panelists and attendees. And we also have Colleen Gratzer from, where are you from?
Maryland.
New Orleans.
Maryland.
And Maryland. I was like, New Orleans? That's not a place.
Yeah. No. Hey, Pete.
Coffee required. Adam from Williamsport. Matteo from Italy. Dawn, Boston. Awesome. Maureen, near Boston. Everyone's saying hello. Omar from Houston. Matthew. Leslie is here as well from Michigan.
Hi, Leslie.
Adam from Westminster. MD, born and raised. What's MD?
Maryland.
Oh, really?
Yes.
There you go. There's only 7 in Australia, okay?
Okay.
It's really easy. And we use 3 letters as the acronym. So it's like,
okay, there you go. All right, I'll give you that.
Thanks. Yeah, trying. Got California, and that's about it. Cool. All right, Lynn from Texas. Welcome, Lynn. Awesome. Great to have all of you on, and great to have Colleen Gratzer on as well. I'm really excited for this webinar. There's a lot of content to go through, so we'll dive in. But really what we're going to be going through today is helping you learn more about accessibility, how it's relevant to your own business as someone who builds websites, potentially builds apps, but working on the internet. And then how's it relevant for your clients as well? Like, why is this stuff important? And then some action steps that you can do to educate your clients and educate yourself as well to deliver better projects. Cool. I will be the professional mouse clicker today. Colleen will just be directing me with what to do, and I'll be asking all the tricky questions, of course. Yeah. So big welcome to everyone. Thank you so much for joining. While we're here and we do have quite a lot of content to go through, I highly recommend and would implore you to please turn off your phone, put it on silent, just close all your tabs. I just looked at the state of my tabs, and I was like, I use one tab and they're all just compressed and gone for now. So it's all nice and clean and we can all be focused. So please do myself and Colleen the courtesy of giving us your undivided attention for the next 40 minutes. I, of course, am Simon Kelly, and this is Colleen Gratzer, who's Chief Creative Accessibility Consultant and Design Mentor as well. And podcast. We could have just had a list of things going on there. The list goes to the bottom. Yeah. And podcaster. Cool. So jumping straight in. Without further ado, Colleen, why accessibility?
Well, as a designer and a developer of websites, what you need to understand about accessibility because of legal implications, and also to protect yourself and also to protect your client. And you want to understand more about accessibility and how it's going to, affect all these parts of the website too, how the user is going to get content.
Mm-hmm. So when it comes to legal issues, what's going on there?
So if you're not having the conversation up front about the potential legal ramifications, if you're not having that conversation up front with the client, then you're potentially exposing yourself and the client to legal issues. Mm. And you also have to make sure, of course, which we'll get into later, about, how to protect yourself if they don't go for that.
Exactly. Yeah, we'll just tell you it's an issue now, and then we'll actually tell you what to do about it a bit later on in the presentation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's good for business. Mm-hmm. A UK study actually showed that 71% of disabled users will leave a website that is not accessible. So it's a large chunk. And then the Australian Human Rights Commission, they said that people with disabilities are 3 times as likely to avoid an organization and twice as likely to dissuade others because of an organization's negative diversity reputation. So if they go to a site or they do business with an organization and it's not accessible, then 3 times and 2 times as likely to leave and to dissuade others from doing business with them.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, it's a lot. And SEO benefits, sites that are accessible are faster as a result of cleaner and leaner code. And so, of course, a lot of you will know that means you can get a boost in SEO from Google. And then when you build accessible websites, you're enhancing your expertise and your offer, what you can offer to the client.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big ones here. Just a little show of hands in the chat box. Is this something you're interested in, like enhancing your expertise, like learning about accessibility, so you could potentially sell projects with this in there? So you could charge more for them, position you as an expert. Just give us a why if that's something you're interested in. Jamie says 1,000% yes.
Yeah.
It's a complicated way to spell why, but that's okay. I get what you mean.
Yeah, it's also going to build a better website too. But yeah, so when you know accessibility and how it affects websites, you're differentiating yourself from your competitors, because most of your competitors are not doing this. They're not even bringing it up. So this could be the edge that helps you get a project too.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'd be curious, and maybe this will come down to Q&A, be curious about if the other, like Squarespace and like WordPress.com, I wonder what kind of accessibility they have. I'll just park that for Q&A.
I have no idea about any of those.
Yeah, cool. I'll park that for another time then.
So in terms of credibility, when you know about accessible sites and at least have the conversation with the client, that makes you more credible, because your client, clients don't usually know this. So you're bringing it up, adding to your credibility.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So what's the big problem?
Well, we have lots of different problems. So if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide. Yeah, uninformed. So most web designers and developers, as I mentioned, and their clients don't think about accessibility at all. And unless they or someone that they know actually has a disability, they're not really thinking about it. But another thing to consider is, you might not have a disability now, but you could one day. And that could be a temporary disability. That could be like maybe you break your right arm or something and you can't use a mouse, or maybe it's a permanent disability. So, these are all things that, even though they don't affect us right now, or they might not affect us ever, but, they're important to think about. And the clients don't often think about how this affects their business. And they often think that they don't serve anybody with a disability. So insufficient testing. So many web developers and designers that do address accessibility, they only address visual disabilities. So like I answered earlier about a question, I've heard, oh, well, I tested the site with a screen reader, so that means that I don't, like the site's fine, I don't need to do any more testing. And that's not the case, because keyboard navigation is extremely important. And testing for a screen reader is only going to be affecting, that's only going to help users who have vision issues. So screen readers only help vision issues. There's tons of other disabilities. There, are disabilities that might require the use of an alternative keyboard, a sip and puff system, which is activated by inhaling or exhaling. And then there's a joystick, which can be used to control the cursor on the screen, and it can be manipulated by your hand or feet or chin. Then there's also a trackball. There's also a wand and stick, which is used to press keys on the keyboard, and it can be worn on the head, held in the mouth, or strapped to the chin. And hands-free electronic pointing device and touchscreen. So those are different devices that could be used based on somebody's disability, which those could be things that help them physically get around easier on the website. So with legal issues, most designers and developers aren't having this conversation about accessibility at all. So like I said in the intro, you know, that can lead to potential issues for them, but also for you. The client could actually end up with a claim made against them, you know, or a lawsuit, and then they might actually go after the designer or the developer. I mean, I've actually heard about this happening, being part of the accessibility community. I've heard of this happening a couple of times now, where there was a huge corporate client in the US, and they had a site built, and then they got sued because it wasn't accessible, and then they went after the developer and they're suing them. So, but even if a client is not legally required to have an accessible website, like if they're not required to comply with accessibility laws, waiting until somebody complains is not like the right approach at all, and that could actually cause more trouble.
Yeah, exactly. You're just waiting until the lawsuit comes in and you owe lots of money.
Right.
See, I'm just jumping in as if nothing happened, right? Like,
right? I mean, thanks.
yeah,
I'm sweating bullets over here, but thanks.
Yeah, that's all right. No worries.
No, so
You're doing a fantastic job.
I was trying to keep everyone entertained. So with these lawsuits in the US, you know, a lot of you have probably been hearing about these lately, these ADA Title III website accessibility lawsuits been going nuts. I mean, in 2017, there were 814 of them. And then in 2018, 2,258. And that number this year is steadily going up as well. And this is data from Seaforth Shaw, and they are accessibility lawyers. And they have a whole blog that tracks, they talk about this and they track all this information and put it out there for people. So it's really helpful to check them out. Now, New York and Florida in the US, those are the two highest ones. They have the highest number of cases of lawsuits. And then there was a case in the US where a blind user was not able to navigate a website and sued both the company and the developers, okay? And they claimed that the website developers were directly responsible for the inaccessibility of that website. And in New York, there have been lawyers going on the prowl, seeking out and going after, you know, companies with inaccessible sites. They're actually like going around the internet and looking around and seeing what they can find. So, you know, I'm not a lawyer, of course, and you should, you know, consult one about, you know, some of this, but, you know, especially like what you need to put in your contracts to protect yourself, especially, you know, if the client says, well, we've talked about accessibility, but I'm not going to go that route, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Yep. I'm just going to take over the screen sharing there. And we're back to our regular programming. Yeah, it's like what you're saying there, Colleen. It's scary. Like that scares me, and I don't want that to happen.
Right.
People are going through the internet looking for sites that aren't accessible, and then going, oh great, here's an opportunity to make some money by suing someone. That's awful, and I hope we're going to learn about how to protect ourselves.
Well, technically under the ADA, what I've heard is that you really can't get damages under the ADA. And again, that's the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can't really get damages, but the companies end up having to pay huge fines. They're just like writing a blank check. And just because you have a claim made against you because your site's not accessible, doesn't mean like somebody else can't come along and come after you too. I mean, they're not going to be like, oh, well, I've already been sued for this, so you can't sue me. It doesn't work like that, because they could have a number of suits, because a lot of times they're given a time limit. Hey, you got to fix this site within 2 years.
Right.
And in that 2-year period, somebody else can come along and sue you.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so we have a lot of accessibility myths. And myth number 1 is that accessibility only applies to a small population. Now, here are some figures for you to take in, and that is, according to the World Bank, 1 billion people, which is 15% of the world's population, has some form of a disability. That's a lot of people. And then in the United States, according to the US Census Bureau, about 20% of people in the US have a disability.
Mm-hmm. And this could be anything from, you know, vision impairment to, yeah, all sorts of different things, right?
Yes, it could be
Yeah.
a cognitive disability, it could be vision related, it could be hearing related, it could be physical. Yes.
Right.
And so myth number 2 is that accessibility only benefits blind people. So yeah, because there are so many different types of disabilities, so visual doesn't just have to be blindness. I mean, it could be color blindness, low vision, blindness and cataracts, and then hearing related could be deafness and, you know, partial hearing loss, and, you know, ambulatory, lost limb, broken arm, you know, again, could be a temporary or permanent disability, chronic arthritis, and then we've got neurological and cognitive ones such as dyslexia, stroke, cerebral palsy, and multiple sclerosis. You know, and so you can't look at somebody and necessarily tell that they have some of these disabilities. And, you know, in some countries, the visual disabilities actually comprise the smallest portion of all types of disabilities. So a lot of people want to focus on blindness, but there's so many others. That's just one small piece of it.
Yeah, exactly. And if we're thinking about using websites, like, you know, most of us, it seems like 80% of us would be very lucky that we're able to see websites properly, use the mouse properly, use the keypad, well, properly, I mean, to our full dexterity, without any impairment at all. So we are quite lucky, and just thinking that the disability is just in the vision, because you're seeing a website, but you need to interact with it in some particular way. Right. And there's lots of different ways that someone could be impaired in what they could get out of a website or a web experience.
Exactly. So myth number 3 is that, oh, my client doesn't serve anyone with a disability. So your client may not specifically target an audience that has a disability. Like, I work with some nonprofits that actually do work with people with certain types of disabilities, but just because your client doesn't target, you know, an audience that has a disability, it doesn't mean that accessibility doesn't apply to them. You know, you can't, like I said, you can't look at somebody and necessarily tell if they have, you know, color blindness or low vision or macular degeneration or even hearing loss or a seizure disorder, you know, and the client might only find out that somebody that they serve has a disability because they've contacted them to complain because they can't get around their website, or they bring a suit against them or something.
Hopefully they get in touch with via email first and request that they could make a better website instead of going straight to the suits, to the lawyers.
Right. The myth number 4 is that accessibility is difficult to implement and costs a lot. Well, accessibility is not difficult to implement or have to cost much more when it's not an afterthought. When you have to go and remediate a website after it's been built and everything's all set, the content's already in there, that's a lot more work than it is to just build it right from the ground up and address the content as it's being, you know, put into the site. And when you think about accessibility early on, it's just part of the process. You know, it's a lot more efficient and cost effective. But of course, you know, accessibility claims are going to cost a lot more than that. And I mean, one of the things that I see a lot, because I remediate InDesign files that become accessible PDFs, like, so I work in InDesign for that. And when I'm remediating InDesign files that a client's already, you know, worked with and everything, I have to often change their color palette. I mean, there's a lot that has to be changed. So this is like, okay, this really could start at the branding process, you know, way in the beginning, instead of like, oh, now we're working with an existing color palette for the site and for these documents, and now we've got to change stuff, and now everything's off brand, you know. So that the earlier bring it up in the process, the better.
Yeah, you've got yellow and dark yellow as your brand colors. That's not going to look good on a little box on the side. Well, it might look good, and you might be like, "Yes, marketing team says this is fantastic," but can anyone read it even without a disability? Let alone the people who are like, "It just looks like a gray square to me. I have no idea what's going on there." So these are the kind of things you deal with in InDesign, right? Like, the
Yeah, so when
typography, the
I'm doing,
colors. Yeah, wow.
right, so I've remediated quite a few InDesign files from clients. I mean, sometimes I'm actually creating them from scratch myself, which is so much easier than having to take someone else's work and then undo stuff that they did wrong and then redo it.
Just
And then
sue
I,
them.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Seems like that's the easier way to do it. Yep.
so, this next myth is, automated checkers and accessibility plugins are sufficient. I see in so many Facebook groups where all these developers and designers are like, oh, well, you can just go and stick this plugin on the site and, it's going to fix stuff, or this checker is going to check for everything. But no single automated accessibility checker is going to do all or catch all issues. And there are a lot of elements, especially color, that still have to be manually checked for compliance. And, automated checkers can also return a false positive or a false passing result. And there's a lot of gray areas when it comes to the guidelines. And so it really requires somebody to understand those and then kind of interpret them and weigh them with, okay, here's what the guideline is saying, and how is this going to work for usability? Is this going to be the best approach? Because there's not always, there's just not a black and white approach to a lot of them.
Right.
Now, this is an interesting case with Wet Willie's, which is a chain of bars. And in January 2018, Juan Carlos Gil, who is blind and uses a screen reader or screen reading software, not a screen reader device, but screen reading software to navigate websites, he filed a case against Wet Willie's Management Corporation, who owns the bar chain. And he also filed it against Sabre Technologies, who actually developed the website, wetwillies.com. And he claims that the website fails to meet common accessibility standards, and so therefore it's inaccessible to anyone with a disability. Now, his argument is that the business and the development partner, that both of them are liable for violating the Americans with Disability Act. Now, this is going to be a case to really watch, because this is charting new legal ground by claiming that website developers are directly responsible if the website is not accessible, if they create it and then it's not accessible. So in addition to the businesses for which the websites are created, this is a huge issue that they can go after designers and developers. So if this lawsuit succeeds, it would result in a huge shift in responsibility to the designer and the developer for building and then maintaining an accessible website.
Wow.
So you thought you were scared before.
Yeah. Yeah, feeling good now.
Yeah, right. So accessibility, so let's talk about what that actually means. Accessible means that it can be it's a file, it could be software or a website. It means that it can be used as effectively by people with disabilities as those without disabilities, and that people with disabilities will have a similar experience to those without a disability. And accessibility, I like this saying, it's great. So it's essential for some, but it is beneficial to all. And when a website isn't accessible, it means that visitors may not be able to get around the site. They might miss out on crucial information that's presented in an image, like if it's an infographic, for example, and they may not understand the content because it's not being presented properly to them, or it might be confusing. And what's really shocking is that 97% of the top 1 million websites fail a basic accessibility test.
Yeah, it's a huge number. And while that's kind of on one hand, I'm thinking, well, then is it that important? But then on the other hand, that represents potentially a big business opportunity, right? Because if 97% of the top 1 million fail basic accessibility, potentially this is an opportunity for someone with accessibility skills to serve that incredibly large audience.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So when it comes to the guidelines, so the World Wide Web Consortium, the W3C, which you've probably heard of, they created the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is abbreviated WCAG, and we say WCAG for that. And that is a set of universally accepted technical requirements that explain how to make web content more accessible to people with disabilities. Now, like I said before, some guidelines are vague, some are even ambiguous, And you could create a so-called, accessible website that meets all the WCAG guidelines, but really isn't accessible and doesn't make for a good user experience. And, the approach to accessibility is not an exact science. So you really, like I said, you have to take the time to understand and interpret the guidelines and then kind of weigh that approach with accessibility and good user experience.
Yeah, cool. All right. So we've got some of your interpretation hopefully coming along.
And so there are 4 principles of accessibility that those guidelines are based on. And so we call them POUR. So I like to say you want to build a poor website, but not a POOR website, right?
Yeah.
So the first one is perceivable. And perceivable means that the information is able to be taken in and processed by the brain. So, and that can be done with, at least one of the senses, whether that's sight, hearing, or touch. If the information on the site, in the software, in the file, if they can't somehow access that and get that into their brain, then it's not perceivable and it's considered inaccessible. And so operable means the user interface components. Okay, so like maybe you have like a form and then the navigation, they must be operable. And all users, regardless of any type of assistive device that they may or may not be using, they should be able to find and navigate and interact with the content on the site. So you think about search, you think about site indexes and site maps, and that helps users locate content within the site. Now, understandable means that the information and the operation of the website must be understandable. So this could be, the ease with which the user could translate a site if English is not their first language, that the wording is used for the audience based on their age and education level and their knowledge of that subject matter. You wouldn't want to be talking a bunch of medical jargon and technical jargon to the everyday consumer, and it also could involve adding supplemental graphics like infographics or photos, and it's also taking into consideration the hierarchy of the page content, like headings and sectioning off the content to make it easy to understand.
Actually sounds a lot like what would be useful for everyone anyway. So it's it's great guidelines. Yeah.
And then the content has to be robust enough that it could be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of assistive devices and software. So the content should not be, we have to use a certain operating system or browser for this to work with this screen reader, or only the site only works well when JavaScript is loaded. So, you want to make sure that the site is going to work on a bunch of different platforms and not have to be reliant on something in particular, like a Flash. Remember the Flash websites?
I was just thinking that. Yeah. That wouldn't have been very good for people using screen readers. Please install the Adobe Flash plugin. You're like, what is this? Why does every website say that?
So when it comes to conformance, there are 3 levels of conformance to the WCAG guidelines. And there's A, which is the minimum, and there's AA, and there's AAA. So AAA is the strictest. It's most people are going to be going for the AA, just right in the middle. And that's typical for conformance unless a client specifies otherwise. And I've never heard of anybody saying just A. It's usually AA, and I've never had anybody say AAA, but I know of companies that do that, but I haven't encountered that myself.
Who sets these? As in, like the client sets these, or it's requirements from somewhere else? Like who sets if it's going to be A, AA, AAA?
Right. So it would be the client should be able to tell you what laws they are required to abide by, and that may dictate the level of conformance.
Okay, gotcha.
So it's like there's a law that tells you, you got to have this and this accessible, and then the guidelines are going to tell you, okay, here's how you do that. Okay, so what does accessibility affect? So we've got site structure, which is the theme, and then the underlying HTML code, like especially the semantic HTML tags. You know, when you use a div, it doesn't convey anything to a screen reader. But if you use semantic HTML tags like these, they actually convey meaning. And so they're like, oh, I know where I am on the page. And yeah, so div tags are meaningless. I mean, they're okay to use, but you don't want to use a div tag, say, in place of a header or any of these other, you know, tags.
All div everything. It's like sometimes if I'm getting a bit lazy, it might happen. Anyway, I digress.
So for functionality, you want to make sure that you can navigate the site properly, and that that the user be able to navigate the site properly, regardless of disability, and that they would have the ability to resize or translate the text. And that also would mean that forms need to function properly and display clear error messages. I mean, I'm even annoyed when I fill out a form and I can't tell where there's an error on the page in the form. And I'm like, you know, I got to scroll up and down and try to find it. So, and then making things clear about those error messages, like what the heck do I type into this field, you know? And, you know, you can add features to the site to give the user more control as well. So when it comes to headings, headings convey a visual and a structural hierarchy to the reader, and they convey relevant content to the search engines. So like a heading 1 is going to be, you know, the main heading, and then subheads are going to, you know, follow suit, you know, H2, H3, and so forth. And you really have to make sure that and clients do this all the time, you've got to make sure that you don't style body text with a heading, because when you're doing that for looks, it's actually changing the page structure. It's an improper styling for the page content in that sense. So I actually do, I would, when I've done sites for clients, I've actually edited the visual editor and gone in and just given them like a faux heading. And I'm like, here, don't use an H2 for this. You know, you can use this if you want something to stand out on the page, because that way it's just a regular paragraph style that just looks a certain way.
Yeah.
And when it comes to color, the number one rule of accessibility is that color alone cannot be used to convey meaning. And you also need to have sufficient contrast between the colors that are used next to one another. So think about like hyperlinks in a sentence, you know, body text, but also think about in relation to the background color that they're on. And even if you are talking about like a pie chart, if you have two colors next to one another that don't have enough contrast, how would somebody make out that those are two different pieces? Mm-hmm. And you can actually have too much contrast for some users, but usually the problem is that there is too little contrast.
It's thinking, I swear.
Okay. As long as you don't go out on us again. Okay, so here's an example of ways that you can distinguish meaning. So, you know, we have the semantic HTML tags to distinguish or to provide meaning and distinguish from, you know, other parts of the page. So we also have text size, and then the font weight, and then contrast and styling. So in this example, we've got two different headings. We have, you know, on the left side, we've got a main heading and then a subhead, but you can't tell the difference because they look the same. You know, they're the same color, they're the same size, they're the same weight. But on the right side, you can tell that the top heading is higher on the hierarchy, right? Because it's a little bit bigger than the other one, and it's bold. And then with the hyperlink, you really can't tell too much that word "this" is yellow, and there's not enough contrast between it and the words in white. So on the right, you know, that's an example of one way to style a hyperlink so that it would actually be obvious that that's a link. So ways that you can test the color contrast, Simon, if you want to go ahead and pull up that web aim.
Let's check it out. All right, tell me what to do here. What are we doing?
So you can put
contrast checker.
Okay, so the contrast checker, this is where you can go and, I mean, there's lots of different color contrast checkers, but I like this one. You can just go and input any color. And so if you're working with an existing color palette, you know, you can just come in here and put in the hex codes for the foreground and the background color that you're going to use with it. And then after you do that, it will show you if it passes or fails for normal and large text. And now if you're going to be going by level AA of WCAG, then you only pay attention to those. So in this case, it's fail for normal text and it passes for large text. But for AAA, you can see that it fails for both because that's a stricter standard or stricter conformance level. AA is going to require a contrast ratio of at least 4.5 to 1 for normal text, and then 3 to 1 for large text. And so large text is defined as 14 points, or like that would be more for like print, obviously, but on the web, it would be almost 19 pixels, and it has to be bold, or it can be larger. Or otherwise it has to be about 24 pixels and larger, but not bold. So it has to be, you know, bigger, like a certain size, you know, bigger than the body text and bold or larger, or 24 pix, any weight and larger. And then AAA is a lot stricter, as I mentioned. That requires a contrast ratio of at least 7 to 1 for normal text, and then 4.5 to 1 for the large text.
So for anyone who's trying to take notes for this, we'll have the presentation with the video as well, so you can take the text that Colleen's talked about and the little snippets, and you can have that, copy and paste it, have that saved.
Yes. All right. Am I getting too dark in my room here?
No, it's okay.
Okay, good.
Can you turn up the contrast ratio? Oh, that's actually much better. We need you at about a 5 to 1 contrast, Colleen, if that's okay. We need you to be accessible.
I don't know if I'm sitting in the shadows here yet. Okay.
No, that's okay. Not yet.
Okay. I'll just start disappearing. Okay. So when it comes to images, you've got two types. You've got decorative images, and then you've got, you know, meaningful, essential images. And decorative images are just that. Like if you had a decorative light background texture, or maybe you use an image like in place of a hard rule type of thing, those would be decorative images. And those should have empty alt text, because you would not want a screen reader to read that out. It would just be annoying to the user. And they don't affect the content in any way and anybody's understanding of the content. But meaningful images would be a logo, a photo, an infographic, something where you could put short alt text and that the users would still be able to get that information. Now, the legal requirements, like as I mentioned, some are vague, some are ambiguous, some are stricter than others, and a client might be required to comply with not only a country-wide law, but a state law as well. And electronic documents, especially those that are going to appear on the site, those often fall under the same laws. So you can create a website and then get everything all, you know, ready to go. But it's like, what about those PDFs that they have available for download, or those Word documents, you know? So like I said, the accessible PDFs, if they come from an InDesign file, then I want that source file to work from, and then I make that PDF and test it, and then that goes on the site. So they got to look at that stuff too, usually. So in the US, we've got Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and that outlines the accessibility standards for the federal sector. So that's federal agencies, you know, contractors of the government, employers, and nonprofits or schools that receive funding from the federal government. So those are the ones that need to usually follow Section 508. And that applies to any electronic information technology. So it's not just a website, it's not just an electronic file. It could be, you know, it could also be an app, it could be software. And then we've also got the Americans with Disabilities Act, Title III, and that applies to the internet, and that requires certain private and public entities, like they have some like rules about it, who has to comply, you know, that requires them to comply with that law. But I mean, there are plenty of businesses that don't have to comply with that law that are still being sued. So
yeah, one of my clients actually, they've got an app and like a SaaS product that they serve Google and Facebook in the transportation industry, and they had to go through a process of making their app accessible. That was one of the key things. They went through quite an extensive process to put that together, which gave rise to some opportunity for us to create some collateral for them to communicate the benefits of this, and that turned into a bit more of a, while it's a legal issue and a legal requirement, it also became a marketing tool for us because it was a differentiator, as you were saying at the beginning.
Right.
It's a great differentiator by putting that forward, saying this is what we're doing in terms of accessibility. We are being accessible, and we welcome diversity, and we're looking after people.
And even with apps, like you could have a desktop app, and then you could have, something like a mobile one. Like even with websites, that's like, it's totally different testing. It's like you've got to test the desktop version, and you got to look at on mobile as well and test it. I mean, there's a lot that goes on.
Yeah.
Now, with legal in Australia, what I found in my research, obviously because I don't live there, is the Disability Discrimination Act 1992. So I don't have specifics on that, but that was the one that I found in my research. So if you're in Australia, I would check that out and see how that might apply to your clients. And then in the UK, the Equality Act 2010.
At least that's something from, this century. One for the US is 1973. Like, I didn't even know what an iPhone was back then. Minds would have exploded. It's a touch screen? What? Accessible. It must be accessible.
Well, it's funny you say that, because that's why a lot of the ADA Title III lawsuits are happening, because there's actually, I forget who, I think it was Domino's. I think it was Domino's that said, because they got sued, and they were like, these laws didn't exist at the time when we built our site, so therefore they shouldn't apply. What? Yeah.
Yeah.
So start the conversation with the client, and the first thing you want to do, this would be with a potential client, this would be with existing clients. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. Are you required by law to comply? And if so, by which laws specifically? Because you want to know, you want to find that out, because whoever you're going to have test the site in the process or later after, before it launches, you want them to be aware of that as well. But you want to keep these in mind as you're building the site too.
Yeah. So one thing that we added into a process that we call the reverse brief, which I'm happy to share with anyone. I think I might have mentioned on a previous coaching call, but we have so we do the intake, we have a conversation with the client, go wide, go deep, have them fill out what's called a reverse brief, which is where they give us the requirements. We give them back the requirements, but in our interpretation. And one of the questions we have is, does the website need to be accessible? That's pretty much as far as we've gone. And that is starting the conversation. Because they may say, like, I don't have any idea what this is. Or they may say, yes, absolutely, we need to. If they say they don't have any idea, next steps, I'm not particularly sure, but basically I just educate them a bit on accessibility, and that's it. So that's why I'm on this webinar. Yeah.
And then you want to also find out, are there additional accessibility requirements? Like they could say, okay, well, I'm required to comply with, Section 508 or ADA, for example, in the US, but I have a client who is in California. They also have to abide by California accessibility laws, which what they gave me as a guideline, they weren't that much. A lot of them were the same, but so there was a lot of overlap, but sometimes there are state specific laws to look at.
Yeah, there's a few questions coming up in the chat, but we'll keep going and we'll come back to those. Dawn and Jamie had a couple.
Okay, so we can go to the next one. Which level of compliance? So you want to find out which level of compliance they need to meet. You certainly don't want to be like getting into like just AA and then find out later it's AAA. That's a lot.
Don't assume. Yeah.
Right. Don't assume. And then find out, has anyone brought any legal action against them for not having a compliance site? Because if so, you should probably decline, because that could get you into some sticky matters. I mean, I was contacted by a lawyer a few months ago, and he's like, Well, there's this restaurant chain client of mine, and they've just been sued, and they need to make their site accessible. I'm like, I asked around to a few people, and I'm like, I could probably help with this. I just don't. I don't know that I want to get into that. And they're like, yeah, no. You don't want to be. You don't want to get in the middle of that.
Yeah. Got a bit of recap on the main points. Yep.
Yeah. So you want to understand what accessibility means and how it affects you as a website designer or developer. You want to follow the WCAG guidelines, and then you want to understand the laws surrounding accessibility that apply to your client, and start the conversation with them, whether it's a new client coming to you or whether it's an existing client that you are, working with.
Yeah. So what are some common mistakes when people get started with accessibility?
So,
I think we'll open up for Q&A. Yep.
Okay. So adding alt text to all images, you like I said earlier, you don't want to add them to decorative images. You don't want everything on the site to be screaming at them if it doesn't convey any information. So you don't want to add them to decorative images. And another mistake is using a single site checker to check for issues or to verify accessibility. Like I said, no single plugin or tool is going to check for or fix all potential issues. And so using a plugin to make a site accessible. I've seen a few of these. I see people talking about them. They are not a proper or comprehensive fix. They're not going to suddenly take your site that's full of div tags and give them, semantic HTML tags and then change all the content, because it's not just about the structure. It's also the page content. I mean, I've had to go into 80-page sites, like one by one, every single page, and fix their content. Right. So if you're going to use something like an overlay plugin that's going to make the site accessible, I would only do that probably for temporarily, because, and then develop a new site that is accessible, while that's happening. And then another mistake is to, just tick off the checklist tick off like the guidelines. Okay, I met this guy and whatever. You have to really understand and interpret them, because it's not an exact science, and, some are vague and confusing. And a huge mistake is not having the site audited and tested by an accessibility professional during the process and prior to launch. You definitely don't want to, I mean, some people don't have this done at all, but you want to have it done in the process, but you also want to have it done prior to launch. You don't want to go and launch a site or getting ready to launch it, and then you're like, oh my God, I have to fix this theme, I have to do this, and I have to do that. So let me turn my light on real quick.
Yeah, sounds good. You're becoming less accessible. I've already used that joke, but whatever, that's fine. Paul says, dark. Yeah. Lynn has a great question as well, but we'll power through these mistakes and we'll jump into some, what can we do? Yep.
So ignoring documents, like I mentioned earlier, it's very likely that the documents are going to need to be accessible if the website is, especially if you've got content in those downloadable files that's not on the site anywhere else. I mean, you tell somebody, get some more information or get information about our programs, download this brochure, and that's not even on the site. That's no longer a supplemental PDF. That's got all the content in it. So it's, that's, crucial content they'd be missing out on. And, you unless you do this type of work and remediate Word documents or PowerPoints or InDesign files, you'd have to find someone to do that. I mean, I do InDesign file remediation. I know other people that do Word and PowerPoint remediation as well. So you can make a list of clients and of existing clients that might be legally required to comply or who would otherwise benefit from having an accessible website, and let them know how accessibility will, work for them, because it prevents potential legal issues. It's good business. It provides a better experience for all users, and it's inclusive of all users. It's not alienating anybody and making them feel badly, like they come to the site and they get irritated and frustrated and leave because they can't get around. And it's good for SEO. And then you can make a list of potential clients whose websites show some accessibility issues. I like to check, I'd like to check a few things with the Wave browser extension and the Totally browser extension. And then I also do some keyboard navigation testing. And if you see a lot wrong on the site, or if they're legally required to comply, you know, then you can have an accessibility specialist do an audit on the site to detail what needs to be fixed. Like when I do audits, I provide a report of the errors. Like I look for like a whole bunch of different things, like it's like almost 70 things. And then I provide a report of the issues and then how to fix them.
Right. Yeah, definitely some good questions coming in here. We've got Q&A just after this.
Yeah, so I have an upcoming accessibility course that will cover, you know, a very strong and comprehensive foundation for this. I mean, it's not the be all end all of accessibility. There's so much going on. I mean, it's really hard for anybody to try to cover that all in one course, but it's very comprehensive and covers so much of the foundational parts of accessibility, content, the structure, all of that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. That sounds great. And Q&A. We have quite a few questions here.
Yeah.
And I'm just going to read them out. So Jamie mentioned, and this was towards, I think when you were talking about some of the statistics around accessibility, is this mainly US based or worldwide? And then afterwards you did cover a bit more worldwide, but
well, the U.S. Yeah, the U.S. It has been it's just been a mess. So those statistics were only about the U.S., but there are accessibility issues going on all over the place. I mean, the accessibility community that I'm a part of, like on an email list, I see people all over the world talking about this. It's not just a U.S. problem. It's just that the U.S. it's blown up.
Yeah. So. It seems like people are able to sue whether the client is required to comply or not, and standards keep changing. This question is from Dawn. How can we keep up? Like, how can we protect ourselves, protect our clients, and I guess kind of balance between like doing the work we need to do. Sometimes it's hard enough to get those kind of gigs, but then also educate the client that accessibility is important. So how can we keep up?
Well, one thing is to, you know, check out that if you're interested in keeping up with the legal stuff, check out that Seaforth Shaw website. And I think it's like 80 Title 3 is a Roman numeral, small Roman numeral. But if you look it up, you'll find it. But they have an ADA Title 3 blog. I mean, obviously that's for the US, but another thing you can do is have your client do like an audit every year on the site, you know, especially if they're required to comply, like to make sure that it's got that ongoing compliance, because as they get in there and mess with content, they could, you know, mess something up.
Yeah, exactly. And I can see that, you know, you could dive right into the legal requirements with clients, but also even just the site being more user-friendly and just, not so, we've got to make it look exactly like the brand. It's got to be all this fancy. It's like, well, the more you do that, the less that people can actually access this.
Right.
The less it's accessible to not just people with disability, but to everyone. It's getting harder and harder. If you've got all your faculties and everything's perfect, great. You're just catering for yourself and people like you, but what about everyone else? And there's a significant number of those people. So take them into account.
Right, there's that. And then there's also the SEO benefits as well, and having a faster, leaner site. So yeah.
Yep. Lynn says, is there a page builder that's known for being friendly in building accessible sites?
Well, I haven't done any accessible sites myself with a page builder. The problem with page builders, though, is that they give the client so much reign to mess up stuff when they're adding page content. And I mean, when I build an accessible site, I've used advanced custom fields, and I've like added in fields for them with instructions, like you need to make sure that you fill this out this way, you know, or, you know, don't use. I take away their access in the visual editor to even use an H1, you know. So if they have that same kind of access in the page builder, that's going to be a problem too. You want to keep them. There's a way to lock them out, I suppose, to lock them out of having too much of that. Away. Right, exactly.
Yeah. We built this for you, but you can't drive it. I'm sorry.
Right.
Yeah. So Leslie says, what do you think is the best time during development to test accessibility?
Well, if you're doing a redesign, it would be great to get an audit of the design. So the first thing I
Right.
would be doing, like if I've had people come to me all the time. They're like, okay, we're getting ready to redesign our client's site. We need your help. And I'm like, okay, when you redesign it, I want to see that before you ever send it to the client. There's no point in them even seeing it if I'm going to tell you, no, that's not going to work. Whether that's
Yeah.
going to be, you plan to have this slider here or something, or it's this color combination with a contrast issue. Like I want to see it before you send it to the client, and then then what I can do is provide guidance on, okay, now I can tell you what to mark up that content on the homepage with, and then you can go in and build that. So it's very important to do in the design phase, and then also in the middle of the development phase. But it can just be like a design audit, and then it can be more of like a back end and code audit and test and stuff like that in the middle.
I can see like a baby step here, and please correct me if I'm wrong there, but so I'm just thinking of a recent project we did. It was like a redesigning a website and to help improve lead generation. And as we're going through the design process, there were some elements that were like, well, like it's a bit subjective whether this is particularly user friendly versus it looks like the brand. And I think by introducing accessibility into this, it's like, yes, we want it to look a particular way, but also we need to make this accessible, and we're alienating some users if we make it too fancy and complex. So almost like putting it back on the client and saying, well, we need to make it more accessible. We want more users, and I'm sure you do too, to be able to access this site and use it the way you intended it to. So adding this fancy piece in is actually going to exclude them. Do you still want to move forward with that? Like who will say yes to that? So as Lynn was saying as well, like it's a great
argument. You
never
know.
Yeah. Well, it's a great argument for the clients to keep on adding all these bells and whistles. Like, oh, can we make it spin or something? It's like,
yeah, no, you don't want to induce, right? You don't want to induce a seizure in somebody,
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a great way.
Away from subjectivity. Yeah.
It's a great way to also shoot down really crappy design decisions that they want to make.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love it. It's not like I'm disagreeing with you. It's like it's the accessibility guidelines.
There you go. See, it's not me, right?
The guidelines. Howard says, one other thing from Leslie. How do clients know if they're required to be legally accessible?
Well, they should know. Somebody there should know. Maybe not everybody, not maybe every contact there doesn't know, but somebody should know if they're for example, if they're receiving a grant from the federal government, and I will ask, do you get any grants from the federal government? Because I work with a lot of nonprofit clients. I know Leslie does too. So that's something I'll ask too. And then I'll be like, okay, well, can you find out if this has to be, accessible because of that? But usually they're the ones coming to you saying, I need this to be accessible. It needs to meet this law, Yeah.
And let's say you've got 100 clients you haven't worked with for a while or whatever, and you reach out to all of them and you ask them about their accessibility requirements. Chances could be that they will know some level of that. And they're like, oh, actually, thanks for bringing that up because it does need to be accessible. Yeah. Or, all of them don't know. But I think it's worth introducing the conversation.
Yeah, no, if they don't know or they're not aware, that may or may not mean that they don't have to comply, but it's still good to have the conversation because you're still helping them reach a larger portion of their audience, and you're still helping, there's still so many benefits to it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Ryan says, do you provide an accessibility audit to web agencies? Smiley.
Yes, Smiley. Yes. Yeah. So I could do an accessibility audit for, I could provide that to you. I could look at the client's site and then do an audit of that. And if you're doing...
So if we reach out to our clients and heaps of them come back and yes, we do need that. We're like, okay, next steps. I have no idea. Colleen, help us out. What do we do?
Right. So then I could direct you. Okay. If it's not me that could help, then I could have somebody else help you. But yeah. So, awesome. If it's a design audit, that could be done. If it's a more technical audit, that can be done. And then I have a ton of contacts who do the actual testing. And I always have a third party test all my files, and my InDesign files that become PDFs and that do the websites. I always have a third party test all of that. I do certain things in the build process and then I test things, but these testers have the equipment and all this other stuff that they do so much more in-depth testing and all these things that, yeah, it's just a good idea to have that. And then it's a good CYA, as well.
Yeah. And one question, I think you might have answered this already, but this is from Maureen. How do you help the clients find out what their requirements are? Is it just kind of directing them, or do we just ask you like,
I mean, they should know. They might not know like how to meet. They might not know how to meet a guideline. Like they might not know, okay, I've got to conform to WCAG level double or triple A. They may not know that right off the bat, but they should know if they have to abide by a specific law.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, this has gone way over time, and that's totally my fault. So thank you so much, Colleen, and everyone who's been here and stayed for the long haul over the speed bumps. Really, next steps. What's something that we can do next? We kind of already mentioned that, like make a list of your clients, get in touch with them and start that conversation. Yeah. And I think, start having the conversation early on. Like, as I mentioned, baby step for us is just, we mention that as we start projects, like, does this need to be accessible? And we start having that conversation early, and throughout the design process, I'll be saying more and more, like, we need to make sure that these elements are accessible. So let's not make them dance and spin and rotate and go rainbow colors. So as Sonia said, there's more to learn, but it is about initiating this conversation. So I think helping position all of us as people that we do care about accessibility, it's going to keep us, keep our heads above the rest. Let's keep us aware of what's coming up in the future. So thank you so much for your time and educating us and making us feel like we have no idea what we're doing. No.
I don't want to scare anybody, but
no.
You got to protect yourself.
It's real.
Right. It's a real thing. And it's just, it's crap hitting the fan all over the place. I mean, the other thing too is, if you have that conversation with the client, I mean, get something in writing that you had that conversation, and, and especially if they declined, if you're like, hey, I suggested this to you. Sorry, I just want to confirm the details of our call and that I brought this up and you're not interested in that. Something.
Yeah, exactly. We just have this one Google document and it says, does your website need to comply with accessibility standards? They need to write something, or we'll write something, and then they confirm it, basically, is how we do it. How can we follow you around the internet?
Okay, so my client-based business is, I do branding and design and accessible documents and publications, and I mean, anything design, but a lot of accessibility work and file remediation for InDesign files, and then website accessibility audits as well. And then, if a publication needs to be accessible from the get-go, then that's just part of the design process as well. And then Creative Boost is my other company, which I am offering the course through, and that's where I've got resources and training. And I also have the Design Domination podcast. So the course is going to be upcoming very soon. And so that website is where you can get more information about that and get on the wait list. Awesome. So gratzergraphics.com and creative-boost.
Cool. Podcast, Design Domination. That's so rad. Love it. Awesome. Thank you so much again. I really appreciate it. And everyone who's been on the call. After these calls, I always say this is a perfect time to take action. So do something now, strike while the iron's hot. Follow Colleen around the internet, keep her in your contacts list for any accessibility questions. And let's keep the conversation going in the Facebook group. Thank you all again. I look forward to seeing more and learning more about the course as well, Colleen, and listening to your Design Domination podcast. Hope you have an amazing day. Thank you all for joining us. Till next time,
for the opportunity.
Go elevate. Bye.